I tell you what,
It's not like the olden days.
I'm Jake,
I'm Rosie.
and this is our podcast on Superman, who, as everybody knows, is a character from DC Comics dating back to the 1930s, and has had many adaptations in film and television over the past almost 90 years. I've always liked Superman as a character to watch, because of his cool powers, mainly when I was little. And I do like the sci-fi behind him. Obviously, you could argue about whether certain bits of sci-fi make sense or not, but I personally do like the Superman sci-fi and find it does make sense to me. Superman has the dense molecular structure because he comes from Krypton, a planet with a red sun. Obviously, if someone with our molecular structure was there, they would collapse in on themselves because the red sun has greater gravity than our yellow sun. So being on our planet gives him these powers of strength and flight and invulnerability. And the other powers, really, you have to explain in different ways, but that was the original premise. And of course, the fact that Krypton is coming to the end of its life explodes because its star is an old red giant ready to go supernova, that makes sense to me as well. So I do like the setup as a piece of sci-fi.
It's very interesting and makes a lot of sense about how he got rescued from the dying planet and adopted in Kansas and discovers his superpowers and meets all his friends and colleagues, and the characters make a lot of sense and are interesting and engaging.
What we basically know and have watched in the past, as well as over the past couple of months, is, as was mentioned at the end of the previous podcast, the 1970s and 80s film series starring Christopher Reeve as Clark Kent / Superman, and the 1990s television series Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, always billed in this country as just The New Adventures of Superman, as we wouldn't get the Lewis and Clark reference until we watched the episode of The Simpsons about explorers.
I actually think it's a bad idea not to call it Lois and Clark, even if you don't think people are going to get the reference. There are really two USPs, apart from that it's Superman. It's like this is our interpretation of Superman. One of them is that it focuses mainly on the romance, hence Lois and Clark, and also Clark isn't a secret identity. Superman is the secret identity, and Clark is who he really is.
It's very much in direct comparison, particularly to the Christopher Reeve movies, which are not that long before the Lois and Clark TV series. I think to say, oh, well, you've seen Clark as this big disguise, not only the glasses, of course, but the manner and the bumbling and the clumsiness. And here, Superman is the big disguise, which is certainly an interesting, different take on it for the New Adventures.
I did read both of those interpretations have been at some point how they approach the comic books, and actually anything pretty much that you're presented with in any Superman production adaptation you can read, yeah, that was in the comic books, and a lot of it's completely stupid and a lot of it's fine and a lot of it is kind of going back on what they originally said because it was no longer working. When people are making a film or a TV show, they feel quite free to take anything they want from all those decades of comic books, and I suppose that's fair enough. Although sometimes, as audience members, we don't always engage with it.
Yes, of course, it's a classic defence for any idea anyone has, official for television or some sort of fan work. Oh, well, it's canon because it's this, that, and the other. And as you were saying when we were discussing all the different sorts of kryptonite he'd had at one point, there's so many comics over so many years. As you were saying just now, so many things have happened and then been retconned and so on. Yeah, you really can do anything with it, and oh yeah, well, it's canon.
I approve of the way Christopher Reeve and friends pick their rules and stick with them. For instance, you never hear about any kryptonite except for green kryptonite. There's nothing to do with him being charged by the sun and you can weaken him by putting him down a dark hole or anything like that, which I suppose is easier to do if you've made 4 or 5 movies than if you're trying to sustain a television series.
That's right, because Superman really is an overpowered character, and if you're going to think of ways for him to be genuinely challenged, it gets very difficult filling, as they did, 4 seasons, and they wanted to fill even more. So yeah, going back to the canon, very understandable.
And when they were using in Lois and Clark, put him down a dark hole and then he won't be as powerful. And it was also, in which we'll probably talk a bit more detail about, was Superman Returns, that idea about the sun. I thought, well, what the hell is that? Christopher Reeve doesn't need that. What's this? I'm going to look it up on Wikipedia. And I did, and of course it said, as you might be able to anticipate if you didn't know, the DC execs all sat down around a big table and said, look, we're really running out of ways to challenge Superman. We're going to have to think of something. So after many years of this not being a thing, for the next incarnation of the comic it became a thing.
And it is how you get the explanation for the laser vision, particularly, and other powers. Superman's body acts like a huge solar battery and absorbs the power of our sun and uses it in certain ways. And that's about as far as I personally can engage with the sci-fi idea. Now really, as a rule, I don't like superhero stuff very much. We podcasted about the Incredible Hulk and discussed how the thing I like about him in the TV series is very different from the comics.
Myself, I'm really not very interested in anything to do with the Incredible Hulk that is inspired by the comics. It's just the TV series, which is more like Quantum Leap or The Littlest Hobo or something.
And I don't really like Spider-Man or Batman or that sort of thing.
No, I don't like any of them much.
But I do like the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, generally speaking. I was reading the Superman wiki the other day and found the Christopher Reeve movies universe referred to as the Donnerverse, which I didn't think was that good a name for it. Richard Donner was the director of the first movie and started out as the director of Superman 2 and was replaced by an Olden Days enemy, Richard Lester.
We've already blacklisted him in our Musketeers podcast.
But I suppose Donnerverse, well, we know what that means. We've been watching the 5 movies in that universe, in that franchise, over the past few weeks. And like with the Lois and Clark TV series, a lot of the things we've discussed about them has been what's wrong with them. But as I say, overall, I do like the Christopher Reeve movies. I find them colourful and engaging and stimulating, and they allowed me to engage with the character of Superman and enjoy his powers and enjoy Christopher Reeve's very immersive performance as Clark and Superman when I was little, and I still do now. That's why overall I think they're my favourite superhero thing, not counting the Incredible Hulk TV series, even though, as we've been discussing and will now explain to you, they are tremendously flawed. It should be very easy to get together in 1977 a cast of actors to play the Superman characters, director Richard Donner, and to plan to film over the next couple of years back-to-back Superman movies, 1 and 2, to make a kind of continuous story. Basically, part 1 is about Lex Luthor being the baddie, and part 2 is about the baddies we're introduced to at the very beginning, coming back into it and being the baddies. And there are your 2 movies. But of course, human nature being what it is, they ended up in Superman 2 with a different director, with Marlon Brando having spat the dummy and backed out of it and really made the second film very awkward in many ways. And yet really, as we've been saying to each other while watching these movies, bits of the first Superman movie and a lot of Superman 2 could still be edited together to make what I would judge to be the best there is of Superman the franchise.
When I got Lois and Clark on DVD about a year and a half ago at time of recording, I got a bit of a Superman kick, and I looked up all these things on Wikipedia about the yellow sun and types of kryptonite and which is the secret identity and all that stuff, and I was interested to see pictures from the comics of the characters. And after that, when we watched the movies, it particularly struck me they've really gone for living comic book, haven't they? You said it's colourful, which is true, and that's very much because comics are colourful. The actors, I think it's fair to say, are slightly unconventional looking, and that's because they got the people who A, were suitable for the part and could act well and had chemistry with each other, and B, looked the most like the comic book drawings that they could manage. Marc McClure in particular, they really made by dressing him and combing his hair a certain way look like Jimmy Olsen from the comics.
Yes, they very much have gone for the living comic book in that way, and the colourfulness being a part of it. And much as I wouldn't really want to sit down and read a Superman comic book, seeing that live-action version of it is the way I've managed to engage with Superman. We were discussing just before recording this podcast how Marc McClure was probably 18 when they first cast him as Jimmy, 19 when they started filming Superman. He's probably 21 by the time they finished mopping up Superman 2. And by the time we get to Superman 4, he's knocking 30. And he is the only actor who is in all 5 films in the franchise, including the oft-forgotten Supergirl. And I think Marc McClure should be very much admired as an actor because he's always very keen and very grateful for the work when asked to reprise a role. And you can really rely on him because he's in, as I said, all 5 films in that franchise. He came back to film little bits for Back to the Future 2 and Back to the Future 3 after appearing in Back to the Future as Dave McFly. And even though they cut his scene from Back to the Future 2, he still got his money for it. You can see it on the DVD. So I have a lot of respect for Marc McClure as an actor and a professional. And I certainly wouldn't say I don't enjoy watching him playing Jimmy Olsen and Dave McFly either.
When you were reading about that, how he was the only actor who'd ever been in 5 of a movie series or something like that, we were saying, oh, it's not like that now, is it? Nowadays you sign an actor for 3 movies and hope to sign them for 3 more when they make a ton of money.
I seriously think if you can find someone who's played the same character in the same franchise that's not James Bond 5 separate times in the 20th century, I think that list would narrow down to Marc McClure as Jimmy Olsen. Christopher Reeve, as I say, is absolutely brilliant in those films. Bumped down to 3rd billing in the original after Marlon Brando and Gene Hackman. But he really lives the part and does a wonderful job, and he sometimes reminds me of John Irwin as He-Man. You were talking about how he's very good at delivering those heroic lines in an amusing but not too cheesy and funny way, bringing the hero to life, making us laugh but also making us believe in it. I think he very much does that with Superman. An absolutely brilliant performance. We were particularly enjoying, weren't we, in Superman 3 when he was starting to become jerk Superman and he was letting his attraction to Lana take over and he wasn't really bothered about the truck on the bridge and he's going, oh, I can do that later. Well, I'll get there in time. I always do. Lana's thinking, hey, this guy's a jerk. Margot Kidder as Lois Lane, I think, is absolutely wonderful. The warmth and quirkiness she brings to the role are absolutely brilliant. And it was very much striking me during the first movie when we were watching it. She makes Lois nice. She's quite confrontational and judgmental of Clark's little mistakes, but she makes Lois affable about them and makes the character very likeable. See why Clark enjoys their interaction. She's not one of these women who comes to you and be's horrible and brash and nasty, even though you could easily play it that way, and I think Margot Kidder did a wonderful job.
There is that scene you have to do when you're adapting Superman where Lois is introduced to Clark at the Daily Planet newspaper and gets told he's going to work with you or on your territory, and she has to get a bit upset about it. And I'd seen on YouTube a bit of the cartoon series that is probably the best known one where that happens, and this animated Lois is an absolute dick about it. She doesn't have a nice word to say to anyone. Perry turns up with Clark, and Lois is all like, "Who's this? What's he want? Work with me? No, I don't think so. Go away. I don't want to know you." And then, of course, we saw Lois doing it in Lois and Clark, and she wasn't as bad as that, but nor was she as nice about it as Margot Kidder as Lois.
Even in Superman 4, I did find her performance as Lois a highlight. I read quite a disparaging thing once, a review from someone of Superman 4, which everybody hates anyway, which said something like, "Oh, it's sad to see Margot Kidder all depressed and ill and on drugs and struggling to play Lois." I thought that was a very unfair assessment of her. I was struck when we were watching Superman 4. She was still bringing so much warmth and quirkiness to the character and still capturing that kind of feeling of wonder and romanticism she had for Superman. And actually, Lois gets a very bad deal in Superman 4. She's Superman's kind of confidant and emotional support, and with the right triggers, Clark's emotional state, she remembers that Clark and Superman are the same person. And instead of pointing out to him that he's emotionally abusive with his memory for getting kisses and so on,
taking her flying and dropping her.
Exactly. She's just very kind and supportive to him. And if she was looking 10 years older than in the original and perhaps a bit ill during that filming, I think it's very unkind to point it out and say it's a bad thing, because I think she still did a wonderful job. The other actor who's in all 4 Superman movies is Jackie Cooper as Perry White, who perhaps isn't as striking as Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder at bringing the films to life, but he's certainly there holding them together, being in charge of the Daily Planet, providing that very necessary professional fulcrum that the setup needs, and I think he does a very good job as well.
Yes, I think so too.
Gene Hackman is in 3 of the Superman movies, not Superman 3. He didn't do any extra filming for Superman 2 when Richard Lester was brought on, and he got his top billing credit and plenty of money. But some bits of him in the film are a body double and a voice impersonation, and that does make it a bit weird. I do enjoy Gene Hackman in the movies, but he does have to do some pretty silly things with some pretty silly sidekicks, doesn't he? I don't think you were enjoying any of the Lex Luthor scenes at all.
No, I don't think I was. I had been very unimpressed with the comedy villains that they were doing in Lois and Clark, which I've been watching, and then returning to the films after a while, I thought, oh goodness me, they do this with Lex and Otis and Miss Tessmacher so much. That's where they got the idea from. That's why they think they need comedy double or triple act villains for Superman, and I really don't think it works, and I think it's a shame because Gene Hackman is a good actor, and I think it's really rather poor use of him to write and direct the character in that way.
They managed to tempt him back for Superman 4 probably 10 years after he'd last been filming as Lex Luthor, and they give him his nephew Lenny Luthor as a sidekick. I've at times been quite tickled by parts of John Cryer's performance as Lenny Luthor. Do the steal, you're gonna get it. Oh no. But you were saying while we were watching Superman 4, a better actor could have made Lenny funnier. And perhaps that's true. And I suggested Charlie Sheen, because of course John Cryer was the other 2.5 men with Charlie Sheen. And you said, oh yes, Charlie Sheen would have been brilliant.
Yes, he would have. The first time I watched Lenny Luthor, I did chuckle a bit at him, but then I think it loses something, and I did start to think, someone else could have done that better. And then, of course, when you said Charlie Sheen, I realised he could do that better. I think I was quite right about that. Anything John Cryer can do, Charlie Sheen can do better.
And Charlie Sheen will be very pleased to hear that. So we'll just go through the merits and pitfalls of the 5 movies in the Donnerverse. Superman being an overpowered character, they do try, and in some ways succeed each time, to give him a decent fight opponent. In the first movie, it's kryptonite, and that, I think, makes sense with what I was saying about the planet and the red sun and the radiation from chunks of krypton specific to Kryptonians. So I've absolutely no problem with kryptonite, although how it's used, actually, in the narrative can be rather poorly done.
I do recommend watching on YouTube How Superman Should Have Ended by the channel HISAG, which stands for How It Should Have Ended. It points out all the problems with it that I thought of when I first processed it, which is a long time after I first watched the film as a child. Lex has launched these two missiles and saying, oh, you can't go and get both the missiles, Superman. I'm thinking, yes, you can. And I don't think I'll spoil the animation lampooning of that, but it is very much what should have happened. And of course, in the film, Lex tricks Superman into finding the kryptonite himself by making him look at this lead-lined box and pretending he's hidden a detonator in it. And that makes me think it was pretty silly of Lois Lane to put Superman's weakness that he can't see through lead in the paper, wasn't it?
Superman the movie is a huge undertaking with a lot of money, the biggest budget thus far in 1977 that Hollywood had ever had, a lot of creative input, a lot of care and attention over the actors, and it's very carefully crafted. But perhaps along the way, in some of the bits of the writing, like that Lois printing the weakness for everyone to see, it has stopped making as much sense as it should when you get down to the gritty.
And of course, the way they find out about kryptonite is to say, oh, there's bits of meteorite from Krypton. I just bet those make Superman die and be unable to do anything. And lo and behold, they're right. They didn't even test the theory before they show him the kryptonite. It's a bit of a rush, basically, isn't it?
Yes, in the nitty-gritty, the movie is a bit of a rush job. Even though with an overall look it incorporates everything you need to know about Superman, past, present, future, and includes all these characters used appropriately. It's perhaps a bit too ambitious for its own good. As has been pointed out and noticed online and by us, Superman the movie structurally is very similar to Santa Claus the movie, and the Soul Keys were heavily involved creatively in both those things. They do involve an origin story and the main character going to the North Pole and having an ice fortress there. And then we get status quo as we know it established, and the main villain is introduced about halfway through the movie. And then the main hero thwarts the baddie's plans in some way.
I think it might work a bit better in Santa Claus in terms of making sense because it's a much simpler story.
There's a particular passage of Superman the movie that we like and think is Superman at its best and would like to clip out and use in the Ultimate Superman. But really, the Fortress of Solitude stuff, the Smallville stuff, the stuff with Lex Luthor and the missiles at the end, we want to junk. And I suspect some of your memorable moments of that movie from when we were little are in that passage that we like.
Yes, you must remember this when we get on to Lois and Clark, as the memories I had of Superman going into that as an older teenager. All I could remember from being under 10 were basically all the rescues from Superman and Superman 2 and Superman 3. So to start with, it's the helicopter sequence. Lois ends up dangling out of the helicopter on the edge of the roof of the Daily Planet, and Superman comes to rescue her. And I think I did also kind of remember the guy who's climbing up the building with the suckers, and Superman's there waiting, and he says that very funny line.
Either something wrong with the elevator?
Which is just hilarious, because if there was something wrong with the elevator, you wouldn't do that, would you? When we get to them, I'll say what I remembered from the other ones, but I really wasn't at all sure which was which. They just all were together in my mind of what I remembered of watching Superman, and I really hadn't understood most of what was going on. For instance, I got the impression that it was more like He-Man, Super Ted, Banana Man, The Incredible Hulk, where you don't have your powers until you've got your costume on and you've transformed. And having watched the movies again, I can see why I did get that impression, because of the pretense. When he's Clark, he's pretending that he can't open his drink and things like that. And when you're very little, especially if you've got no prior Superman knowledge, you've got no reason to think he is pretending, have you?
Absolutely. I'm sure it took me a while to work that out. I think it may have been during the junkyard scene in Superman 3, where I realised, he is supposed to have his powers when he's got the office wear on, and he's being Clark rather than Superman. When we were young, they had the first 3 movies, Superman, Superman 2, Superman 3, on quite a few times, and we did have certain memorable bits of them that we both remembered. They never had Superman 4, because everybody hates it, and I don't think we ever watched Supergirl when we were young either. Superman 2, I think, was the one I enjoyed most when I was young, and I still enjoy it most now, and we both agreed, I think, that it's the best one. It utilises probably the best way, I think, to give Superman decent opposition to fight. It has the 3 evil Kryptonians in it. Even though they could do more damage against him, as we were discussing, if they do actually team up and fight him all at once, which they don't actually end up doing. But it is good to see these evil Kryptonians on Earth with Superman's powers and Superman being in contention with them.
Having watched them all very recently, Superman 2 is the only one I really feel I wouldn't mind watching again all the way through.
Thanks to Marlon Brando and Richard Donner and Lester, it is a bit of a mishmash, Superman 2. It has some of that Richard Lester humour that we hate, as has been discussed before, coming in towards the end with the ice cream and the phone blowing over and things, during a scene that's really not appropriate for comedy, certainly not that sort of comedy where the 3 supervillains are threatening Metropolis. But nevertheless, it still stands out as the best film in the Donnerverse. You were saying, and I certainly don't disagree, that it doesn't need Lex Luthor in it, and it would be better without him.
Yes, I do think that. He's weaseling his way into the good books of the 3 Kryptonians by giving them information about Superman. And I think that's also poor use of Lex. And I couldn't believe after all the times they'd said, he's no longer any use to us, let's kill him now, he carried on betraying Superman. And that bit towards the end where Superman says, which is all part of the plan, so don't worry, but where he says, let's team up and defeat them, get them to go in that cupboard over there, Lex turns around and says, don't go in there, General, it's a trap. I'm thinking, what else are you going to be able to tell them after this? There's no way Lex Luthor's that stupid.
In many ways, it's thanks to Terence Stamp as General Zod, Sarah Douglas as the woman Ursa.
Well, that's better than when you see her on the moon and say it looks like a girl.
And Jack O'Halloran as Non, the mute Kryptonian beef, that the movie is saved in many ways. The bits with them on the moon and doing the arm wrestling and blow them a kiss, my dear, to fight the army and stuff were all highly entertaining, despite their inevitable flaws. Look, they need machines to fly, says Ursa. And we say, well, so do you if you're on Krypton.
They talk awful rubbish, a planet with only one sun. Excuse me, I think you only had one sun yourself.
I was disappointed to hear that. I remembered it as the closer we come to a planet with a yellow sun, the more our dense molecular structure gives us great powers. I thought, oh, that's a brilliant way to sum it up, General Zod. But then he actually says only one sun, a yellow sun. So that's mitigated how good that line is.
Yes, we'll cut that clause from our ultimate movie made out of those 2.
But I think perhaps whoever wrote that bit of script was confused by the red sun of Krypton, thinking, oh, there are other suns of Krypton that are different colours. But actually, no, it's the sun of Krypton that is red. But that's all wonderful stuff with those 3 anyway, and the assault on the White House and all the kneel before Zod.
Oh, I like that line, don't I? There's one man who will never kneel before you. Who is this imbecile? That got a laugh out of me. Much more than ice cream getting splattered in someone's face.
And of course, now I'm thinking it's a shame how General Zod's beef with Jor-El that we see played out at the beginning of the first movie, and then they have to completely refilm for the start of Superman 2 and change because Marlon Brando has gone off sulking. And General Zod's all over Superman 2 going, oh, revenge on Jor-El, son of Jor-El. Lex Luthor comes and says, oh, I can take you to the son of Jor-El. And if you've started with Superman 2, you think, well, who the hell is that? So yeah, as I say, it is mitigated quite substantially, Superman 2, and yet it is still very much the best one.
Marlon Brando's soul really stops it making sense, though, doesn't it? Because he was meant to give Superman back his powers after he got rid of them. But instead of that, Clark, with no powers, goes to the North Pole, God knows how, I think he walks, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And tries to hitch a lift off this lorry that's too mean to pick him up. They show us the green crystal thing, and he's like looking at it, and then suddenly Superman's back with all his powers. And I'm like, how did that happen? And it turns out it was something Marlon Brando was supposed to do.
Very unsatisfying, that, isn't it? I think Susanna York must have been quite pleased when Marlon Brando spat the dummy. She plays Laura Clark, Superman Kal-El's mother, and she got to come and do a lot of filming for Superman 2 to fill in for Marlon Brando who wasn't there. I noticed at one point how the fact that she'd come to do fill-in filming and Gene Hackman had already finished meant they had to have one of the Kryptonian elders reading a poem on one of the information crystals. But Gene Hackman says he's not really here, obviously really talking about Marlon Brando.
He was right about that, wasn't he?
Yes, indeed. And then you get another crystal with Susanna York talking about the three Kryptonian villains, in which Gene Hackman could be talking to someone of any gender.
And it's such a shame because you can see how these things have, in a way, really ruined it, but it's still a good film. And it could have been and should have been so much better.
It always struck me in the first one how Marlon Brando's whole sequence where he's talking to little Kal-El and it's very much hammering home the God and Jesus imagery. I send them you, my only son. They have great potential as a people and so on. Jor-El thinks he is God. And so did Marlon Brando.
That does remind me of what we say about the Thundercats and Jarga, and someone who's dead is standing there saying, you have to do this, you can't do that, you've got to do it like this, and you're like, yes, boss. And like I said on the Thundercats podcast, if we all listen to the ghosts of our ancestors telling us the way to do things, this world would be even worse than it is. No one would have any rights at all. There would be no votes for hardly anybody and all that, and I don't know why anyone listens to their dead ancestors when they've got ideas which are clearly better or more appropriate for the time and place that they're in.
I was saying during Lois and Clark, they present it's what your dead ancestors wanted you to do as a good reason to do something. And it's not a good reason to do something. Doing something that's traditional because you think it's a good idea to do it, you want to do it in uphold tradition, that's a good reason to do something. But doing something that's traditional, even though it goes against everything you personally believe in, and it's going to retard the development of your new society, on your new world, is a very bad idea. And because your father's left a video saying to do it, is not a reason to automatically do it.
And of course, Laura's video, that was meant to be Jor-El's video, is the reason that he erases all his superpowers so he can be with Lois, which is such a stupid thing to do. I don't know why he can't be Lois's boyfriend and be Superman. And of course, having very much got interested in Lois and Clark when I'd basically forgotten the films helped me to think that. But it's really stupid, and as you always point out, he doesn't even check if there's any problems. He's just like, oh, I better go and stand in that cupboard and erase my superpowers now.
If he just turned on the telly, he'd have seen, whoops, here's General Zod and his two followers. Better sort that out first before we make any decisions. Make any decisions together, perhaps? Talk to Lois about it? No, just blindly go ahead and do it. There was one particular line that Marlon Brando was saying while talking to baby Kal-El, the son becomes the father and the father becomes the son, where I think, well, that really should be followed up on and isn't. And of course it's supposed to be the kind of death of the Fortress of Solitude, to use using up the last power in it to restore Superman's powers, which is represented by Marlon Brando walking out of the crystal and touching Christopher Reeve on the shoulder, which they kind of try and make up for with the scene of Susanna York walking out of the crystal that actually looks really weird and doesn't make any sense. She doesn't touch him and it's in a different place, and they really shouldn't have bothered doing that. You've mentioned there really the big problem with Superman 2. It is the whole Lois finds out and consequences occur. We always both remembered the early parts of Superman 2, which are exclusively Richard Lester filmed, and yet he hasn't yet got his feet under the table enough to ruin them with ice cream flying around, so that's good. Which is the terrorist at the Eiffel Tower stuff, which is entertaining and has some very good moments from Margot Kidder and Christopher Reeve, and Richard Griffiths as one of the terrorists. And then the big memorable bit being the Niagara Falls sequence. And I think we both remember that very well from when we were little. He saves the stupid, careless child with the even more careless mother who's not watching him. And then Lois, I'm so sure that you're Superman that I'm going to jump into Niagara Falls. And what a wonderful in-character as Clark reaction Christopher Reeve does to that. And oh my God, running after her.
Yes, making quite sure that if she's paying that much attention from splashing about in this great big torrential rivery bit, she won't suspect anything. I did remember that, and I remembered him stumbling and sticking his hand in the fire and saying, oh well, now there's no way I can pretend I'm not Superman, and taking off his glasses. I don't know how I processed that, because he hadn't got his Superman costume on doing that, and he hadn't got his Superman costume on making a branch break off a tree so he can go, grab that branch, Lois, which was lucky that worked.
And of course that leads on to the really stupid, uninformed, untalked about with Lois' decision to get rid of his powers and live with her as a mortal, as one of them, and is a big flaw in the movie. It's tempting to think, it'd be better to see the Richard Donner cast of that movie rather than the Richard Lester cut, and at least it wouldn't have the bit with the ice cream. But one thing I did read about the Richard Donner cut is it has the same crappy ending as the first movie, which is Superman turns back time to save Lois from having fallen into the San Andreas fault in her red hire car. I think even Superman purists have a bit of problems justifying that ending because it is absolutely stupid and makes no sense. And in the big recap of Superman the movie at the start of Superman 2, they make it look like they would have you believe that it was done properly, believably. Superman stopped the missiles, sealed the San Andreas fault, saved the bus full of school kids on the Golden Gate Bridge, saved Jimmy from the top of the collapsing dam, and then came and got Lois out of her car
by ripping the door off.
And everything was fine. And what it neglects to show us was that in the cut of the first movie, she actually wasn't very well there. In fact, she was dead. That's a Vicar of Dibley reference there. So he has to turn back time to bring her back to life. It doesn't seem to undo anything else, like the earthquake's not happening. Jimmy's still saved. People like to try and defend it by saying, oh, well, yes, everything else was sorted by the time Lois was dead, but it wasn't. That village was getting flooded.
The dam got rebuilt.
Yeah. So it doesn't make sense.
And it doesn't make sense that Superman can make time turn backwards anyway in the first place.
That's right. I mean, really, to make sci-fi sense, if he did that to the Earth, all it would do was spin the Earth backwards. Time wouldn't start running backwards, all a load of rubbish. And apparently, in this synopsis I read, this was going to happen again at the end of Superman 2 Richard Donner cut.
That's horrifying, isn't it, that he was going to take that crappy ending and rehash it. No one likes to rehash at the best of times. I'd just say the other bit I did remember from being a child, and that's when they're mucking about on the Eiffel Tower and Lois is under the lift and he comes and saves her from that, and it's one of those very striking rescue sequences. I like the way when Lois is trying to sneak into the Eiffel Tower in the first place. Well, she ends up sneaking, but first she tries to get some officials to let her in by saying, Je suis journaliste américaine. Like, that's going to get you a free ticket to anything. And that attitude is very in character for her.
That was very good, wasn't it? And Margot Kidder made it funny and thought-provoking. Another big problem with Superman 2, Superman's morals.
I'd just like to jump ahead for a moment to Man of Steel, with which everyone's main problem seems to be, despite the fact that it's one thing that's not wrong with it as far as I can tell. Superman killing Zod, who's also in that film, by snapping his neck, in a situation where they've both got the same powers and Zod is clearly evil and clearly endangering lives, and even if you come up with, well, Superman could have run over there and picked up that person and picked up that car and stopped that building falling over, what about the next time and the next time and the next time?
I thought that was made very clear by Henry Cavill on his face. This is the only way this is ever going to end. So he has to do it.
And I agreed with him. And everyone's saying, Superman doesn't kill people. Superman never kills anyone. Why would he kill Zod? Why would he kill an evil Kryptonian who's got the power to annihilate everyone? But are these the same people who watch and admire and prefer Superman 2? I was horrified, because I'd quite forgotten that this happens, to see Superman, once Zod and friends have been tricked into losing their superpowers, he just picks Zod up and throws him down this hole. And then Non, because he's so thick, throws himself down the hole, thinking he can still fly when he can't, and Lois punches Ursa in the face and makes her fall down the hole. So Lois straight up kills Ursa, and Superman straight up kills Zod. And at least Lois and Ursa are equally matched, but they don't have their powers anymore. He could pick him up, fly him to jail, and it's perhaps even made worse by the fact that clearly they need a quick ending at that point. So it's like, oh, they're defeated now, but let's just throw them down the hole so we don't have to say what happened to them next.
As we were saying, you can go back to the comics and find anything for any point you want to make about Superman. I watched this wonderful video refuting those people who say, oh, Superman never kills anyone, where it looked back at some early Supermans where he was killing some people, and some of them seemed quite reasonable. And then, hey, here's a bit where some guys committed some minor indiscretion, and Superman straight up melts his head. So to say Superman never kills anyone is absolutely ridiculous, and whenever he should be taking action and isn't, which happens a lot in Lois and Clark, I say to him, melt that guy's head, Superman. And yes, as you say, the end of Superman 2 there is very lazy. The villains are defeated, let's get them out of the picture and not worry about what's happened to them. That sequence with Superman preparing his trick of moving the rays of the red sun of Krypton out of the chamber so he himself is safe inside and the three villains are exposed to them, banking on Lex Luthor trying to betray him. It may be rather convoluted, and he may make other preparations of the Fortress of Solitude that make absolutely no sense whatsoever with his giant cellophane S and his disappearing tricks. But that sequence where he's tricked them into being exposed to the rays, and he's come out of the chamber, and Terrence Stamp is all like, now kneel before Zod, and he does, and you think, God, how on earth is this going to work out?
That's very effective.
It's very, very effective. And then you get the wonderful John Williams score. He's done all the great scores for things like Jurassic Park and
Jaws.
Really, really underlining the significance. And then you get the heroic bit building back up. Superman is the one who's squeezing Zod's hand, and Zod is the one who's lost his powers. And of course, it was all a trick, and it all worked out. A brilliant moment of cinema there, and perhaps the best Superman moment for me in many ways, despite its mitigations.
It's a shame about its mitigations, yes, that's very good. Of course, eagle-eyed viewers can spot how the light has moved and work out what's happening, and then you get a different kind of experience where you're thinking, oh, Zod, you don't know what's coming to you.
But I'm saying they could have kept it all like that, chuck 'em in the hole, and then had like a news headline saying General Zod and his two cronies imprisoned. Then we don't accept that. We're like, oh yeah, Superman got them out of the hole, took them to prison, like he does to Lex Luthor. It's just very lazy to leave them in there, and does give Superman, yes, questionable morality.
And then, of course, he goes and meets out his own revenge against the guy who picks fights in the diner. when he had no powers, he got into an altercation, and it was with a guy who picks fights in the diner or provokes people into picking a fight with him. But I do think he ought to have listened to Lois. Come on, Clark, let's just walk away. And he's like, no, I'm gonna fight this guy. And of course he can't cope with that at all. Blood, my blood. He goes to all the trouble when he's got his powers back, flying back to this particular diner and throwing the guy into the jukebox. And that's not very good morals either.
And it's very annoying and very morally wrong, I think, to erase Lois's memory at the end with his stupid super kiss.
That doesn't make a lot of sense, that the red sun gives you the power to erase people's memory by kissing them.
So definitely another annoying and senseless ending, but not as bad as the turning back time ending. So Superman 2, it's a funny old animal, a very mitigated best Superman film. As everyone knows, those two were made back to back. They were released in 1978 and 1980 in the end. I think it was originally supposed to be 78 and 79, but obviously that couldn't happen. Superman 3 came out in 1983. They've been working on it for a little while, still with Richard Lester. Apparently, the only bit of Superman 3 that Christopher Reeve liked, which is why he went off in a bit of a huff of his own and refused to do the cameo he was supposed to do in Supergirl, and only came back to do Superman 4 under very special circumstances. But apparently, the only bit of Superman 3 he liked was the scene I was mentioning, the junkyard fight. And that is my favourite bit of Superman 3. And I think good Superman, good Clark in his work suit, not his Superman suit, having strangled his evil side, opening up his shirt, and there's the brightly coloured glowing S, here's Superman back, and again the John Williams music adds to that. That's another very good bit of Superman, highlight wonderful good cinema. And they'd had some very clever use of colour, with Superman's costume getting darker shades of blue and red and yellow, as he himself was getting darker as a character. And when he rips open the shirt, there it is, all nice, bright, shining, fresh and new primary colours, just like Clark himself having shaken off his bad side. So I can certainly see what Christopher Reeve means there. I don't hate the rest of Superman 3, but I can see why Christopher Reeve would. Another thing he'd said about it was he was horrified that it seemed to be less a Superman movie and more a Richard Pryor comedy. Well, you can see why Richard Lester and Richard Pryor got on so well. They like silly, physical comedy that we don't think is funny, and obviously Christopher Reeve didn't think was funny, but perhaps some people do.
It's not appropriate. I agree with him there.
I found very memorable the bits of Superman 3 where he's turned into a jerk, and it's because of almost perfect kryptonite that's been recreated by the baddies. Richard Pryor as Gus Gorman, who's not really bad. He's misled by Robert Vaughn, the man from Uncle, who plays the main baddie, who's called Ross Webster. And his sort of sidekick baddie is his sister, and then he also has this bimbo character who pretends to be stupid and a bimbo for him, but is actually very intelligent, played by Pamela Stevenson.
Oh, what sexism in the writing of those villains, because the women snipe at each other, and there's really no reason. If they were competing for the affections of the same man, I'd still say, well, that's male chauvinism in the writing there, but they're not even doing that, so I don't know why they thought the women needed to snipe at each other.
So when Robert Vaughn wants to kill Superman with kryptonite, and Richard Pryor has made this formula for imperfect kryptonite because it has an unknown element in it, it makes what is almost red kryptonite like you would see on Lois Clark, The New Adventures of Superman. It makes him behave weird. It makes him into a jerk. It makes him go around ruining people's good time by straightening the Leaning Tower of Pisa, blowing out the Olympic flame, flicking peanuts at the mirror in the bar and breaking the mirror. He doesn't want to hurt people, really. He just wants to piss them off and has a lot of ability to do so. And as I was mentioning, when it was starting, it was bringing out his kind of lustful side, perving on Lana Lang, who Clark has always had something of a crush on. And indeed, her presence in the movie, played by Annette O'Toole, is why Lois is demoted very much to sort of beginning and end cameos in that movie, and we're kind of concentrating on Clark and Lana as a ship. And I used to say I quite liked the Smallville bits with Lana and Brad the alcoholic and the high school reunion and Ricky and Buster and the picnic, and another memorable bit, the Combine Harvester bit.
That is one of the bits I remembered, a Superman rescue. He has to stop a Combine Harvester from harvesting this child who's unconscious suddenly in the middle of walking his dog Buster.
And I suppose I do quite like those bits. I wasn't finding them as entertaining this time as I have in the past, I think.
I felt the same way.
And it really is the jerky Superman junkyard fight sequence that is the highlight of that movie for me.
I did remember all that jerk Superman stuff, and I remember not understanding what on earth was going on when Richard Pryor brings him the almost kryptonite. I thought, okay, there's some sort of gathering where Superman is speaking and they're giving him a key to say thank you for being Superman. And then along comes Richard Pryor to say here's a special award for Superman from the army or something he's pretending to be from. And I didn't know about kryptonite. I don't know if I gave up watching the first film before the kryptonite ever came up, or if I just hadn't taken it in, but I didn't know what it was meant to be, and I thought, why is he giving Superman this cabbage?
Yes, cabbage!
Because that was the thing I thought it looked most like. And then the cabbage seems to make him, as I would have said as a child, evil, although as you point out it's not actually evil, it's being a jerk, not hurting anyone, just pissing them off. And then I did remember the junkyard fight, and I thought, oh good, everything's sorted out now, but I really didn't understand why this cabbage would do that to Superman.
Towards the denouement of the movie, what makes Richard Pryor, Gus Gorman, change his mind about his allegiance and come through for Superman, like Miss Tessmacher does in the first movie, is Robert Vaughn saying to him, you're going to go down in history as the man who killed Superman. Gus is all like, oh no, I don't want to do that. And we're like, well really, what did you think would have happened if that kryptonite worked? Everyone would have seen you kill Superman, or very much attempt to kill Superman, up on stage in Smallville in front of a huge crowd. We hadn't thought about that then, had we?
Although he does then phone up Robert Vaughn and say very apologetically, when I gave Superman the kryptonite, he didn't die. So it makes even less sense if you add that into the equation.
Not much of a character journey there for Gus, really. But thinking about giving Superman a decent enemy or handicap, it's partly the corrupted kryptonite there, which works well, and what we don't really like is the supercomputer. That's an enemy for him in this movie and creates this kryptonite beam. It can read you and turn your weaknesses against you. I suppose I can't say that doesn't make sci-fi sense, but it's a bit sort of wishy-washy. Here's a supercomputer that can do this. Of course, Superman, to defeat the supercomputer, has to use what he's learned earlier in the movie in another sequence we enjoy, which is where he stopped this huge chemical fire, and he's discovered this acid that becomes volatile when hot, and the computer doesn't identify it as a threat, and then when it gets hot, it burns all through the computer. Structurally, that should be quite good, shouldn't it? Superman uses something he's learned at the start of the movie to defeat the big villain at the end, but it doesn't really make sense, and it's not really very good, so the fact that it structurally works doesn't really make up for that. There they do bother saying in a sort of newspaper headline, Ross Webster and his two women have been pulled out of holes and put into prison, which they should have done with the Kryptonian villains. Perhaps they realised that after Superman 2 and didn't want to make the same mistake. The next film chronologically is Supergirl.
Everybody hates that too, don't they?
Would it be better if Christopher Reeve had come through and had his cameo? Well, it probably would. It would have anchored it more in the Donnerverse.
And it would have made more sense.
Although Marc McClure does a very good job himself of anchoring it in the Donnerverse. But he's not Superman, whatever other good things there are to say about him.
It would make so much sense if Superman heard his cousin had come to Earth and he just came for a visit, and it doesn't make sense that he didn't.
I do think they tried too hard to cover themselves there by having on the car radio Superman's just left for another galaxy on a peacekeeping mission. So that's why we won't see him in the movie. They should have just kept quiet about it and acted like they meant it, even though it still wouldn't have made any sense. The way they combat Kryptonian powers in Supergirl is really unique to the Donnerverse, and is something that has been used in the comics and in Lois Clark, and that is with magic, with sorcery. And I think we both have a bit of a problem with that way of doing it. Like Thor in The Incredible Hulk Returns, it brings fantasy into a sci-fi universe, and we don't really want to see fantasy, witches, magic, demons being what Supergirl as a sci-fi Kryptonian Superman spin-off has to fight against.
Yes, when the sci-fi is so well set up and grounded and established, it does take you out of it a bit, and discussing that made me realise why I didn't particularly engage with Jenny's magic powers in Bucky O'Hare. A long time ago now we podcasted about Bucky O'Hare, and I said I didn't have anything against Jenny, but I just didn't really engage with the whole magical thing, and that's why it's a bit of a clash. Sci-fi and fantasy can work well together, but in those couple of cases I don't think that they do.
It's about parameters, isn't it? Something like He-Man establishes very quickly sci-fi and fantasy are both a big part of this and work together and are both involved in the legend and the backstory. They're always both there and they're always both well integrated into the universe. Whereas something like Bucky O'Hare is all sci-fi and it's got this magic thrown in that doesn't make sense. And the same is true of the Donnerverse. We've already had these 3 movies, very sci-fi, and suddenly here's Superman's cousin and she's fighting a witch. And it just jars and doesn't really make sense. Having said that, we were both struck, I think, by the thought that there was a lot of potential in Supergirl, the movie, in the world they were attempting to create. Not fully realised at all. But I was pleasantly surprised by that aspect of it. I hadn't watched it for a while on the DVD. The last time I watched Superman movies a few years ago, I didn't watch it. I'll save it for the podcast, I thought. And then we did save it for the podcast, and I was quite pleasantly surprised. The setup of Kara Zor-El coming to Earth and taking on the identity of posh private boarding school girl Linda Lee and getting into a dorm room with Lucy Lane, Lois's younger sister, and learning kind of to be human and Lucy guiding her through that. Little adventures around the school, sorting out the bullies. I thought all that had a great deal of potential, largely unrealised in this particular movie, but I did like the idea.
I quite enjoyed that school segment in its way because I was enjoying the fish out of water kind of thing they were doing with Kara, Supergirl, Linda. Like Lucy Lane was saying, the boys will go crazy if she pierces her ears, and Linda's saying, because I have holes in my ears, and that kind of thing. It's not hilarious, is it? But that kind of was going on in this place. I enjoy that, and it sort of rings true. Aliens pointing out the absolutely crazy things that we do but take for granted. And as you were pointing out, Lucy was encouraging Linda to live, enjoy being human, bunk off curfew and that kind of thing. And they were striking up a good friendship, and I thought those 2 actors had very good chemistry. But also, as you were saying, there wasn't really very much of it, and it wasn't really making a lot of sense. And you did point out she was like walking out in the middle of a maths class to go and do some rescuing. You said she doesn't really need or value this cover that she's gone to the trouble of constructing.
They kind of have Linda Lee, the schoolgirl, and the school set up there because that's what Supergirl does. But it's not really necessary to the movie and doesn't really fit in with the rest of it, and thus I suppose sticks out as a bit with potential. She's gone to all this trouble of typing a letter of reference really, really quickly while the headmaster's out of the room that's supposedly from her cousin Clark Kent, and then rooming with Lucy and sorting out the bullies who are trying to sabotage the showers, and then, it's off to do the plot, and it really has nothing to do with the cover that she spent all this time setting up and drawing us into.
We were saying, weren't we, there just isn't enough time and it would work well as a television series. Of course, there is now a Supergirl television series where they do it all wrong. They've made her into a female Clark Kent with glasses on, and she calls herself Kara, not Linda, and it's all different. And I haven't watched it, but I've seen trailers and read about it. That's a shame too, really, because I think there is potential in the whole Supergirl setup from the comics.
It's also, of course, how they get Marc McClure as Jimmy Olsen into it. He comes to be Lucy's boyfriend, really, and he's supposed to bring a friend for Linda and sort of double date, and that doesn't really work out. But that would work well in the series, I think. The guys who come to see them at the weekend, they go to the diner, whatever. I like that aspect of it as well, as a link through Jimmy to the Metropolis setup.
Of course, Supergirl has a boyfriend in this film. He's a right douchebag called Ethan. The actor they get is not particularly appealing. The way that they bring them together is very unsatisfying. He starts being in love with her because he's got a love potion on him from the witch character. And I was assuming too much, thinking, well, he must be in the comic because that's what happens in a superhero comic. They have a girlfriend or boyfriend and then you have to put them in the film, and that's why he's there. But it turned out that wasn't the case, and actually, if you read about Supergirl's love interests, it sounds very much like they just put her with whichever man is available in that particular story, which isn't a good idea at all. So maybe making this movie, they thought Ethan, the boyfriend, was a good idea, but I don't think that's one of the things that was really working. Of course, she rescues him a couple of times, like Superman will rescue Lois, and you pointed out she can only carry him in things. She carries him in the grabby piece of a bulldozer that he's got stuck in earlier, and she carries him in a Dodgem bumper car, and I said maybe they would think it was emasculating if she was carrying just him, like Superman carries Lois. But then it also occurred to me maybe it would be too awkward to stage it if they had to get this actress to carry a man who perhaps she's not strong enough to hold.
It's very typical of men writing a woman, isn't it? Just stick her with whatever man you think is an interesting man at the time. It was where I found the phrase Donnaverse, looking up Ethan on the Superman wiki. Ethan brackets Donnaverse.
Of course, in the film, this witch Selena is giving him love potions and trying to use her magic powers to get the man, and then Supergirl turns up and Ethan wants her, and she's like, "Oh, she's stealing my man." That's rather dated ideas about women.
They must have thought the franchise was getting quite lucrative because it follows hot on the heels of Superman 3. Superman 3 was released in 1983, Supergirl in 1984. And I don't know, perhaps the two of them together did put the brakes on the franchise a bit. One thing we always remark Supergirl kind of doesn't get is the Phantom Zone, which in the original Superman is supposed to be just this glass square that flies through space and you're trapped in it. But in Supergirl, it's a glass square that flies through space and you're trapped in it, and then it dumps you in this kind of volcano landscape, and that's the Phantom Zone.
Which does directly contradict what we see in Superman 2. If it didn't do that, you could say, alright, then I accept that, but Zord and Friend have been in their square for a number of years. They haven't been in the volcano scape, have they?
And that's the trouble with these spin-offs. They are going to interfere with, established status quo. Superman Kal-El Clark is supposed to be the only survivor of Krypton. Obviously, when you bring in Supergirl, it's got to turn out he's not. This Argo city that Kara comes from is supposed to be some sort of offshot colony of Krypton that knows Krypton exploded and Clark Kent escaped to Earth. They explained it fully in Lois and Clark, which I thought was better, where it was a kind of renegade colony, people who believed Jor-El that the planet was going to blow up sometime soon, went off and made this colony, and now there's a new Kryptonian society there. And Zor-El, being Jor-El's brother, going there with his wife and their young daughter, or perhaps his wife was pregnant at the time. That makes a certain amount of sense. They know Jor-El, they're his family. They're saying, oh yes, perhaps the planet will explode, let's go and make a new colony. But these things do inevitably interfere with what's been established as what has happened already.
Again, it's a symptom of years and years and years and years and years of trying to think of what to put in your comic. And I read that there were a lot of precursors to Supergirl where certain women would have Superman's powers for whatever reason, and I think I read that in the comics at one point Lois had them.
And we certainly can't blame any of the cast for Supergirl's shortcomings.
Except Peter O'Toole. I'm not a fan. I do feel like Peter O'Toole does everything the same and he doesn't really bother trying to interpret the character. So I'm not very keen on him. I think the rest of the cast is very well chosen.
Yes, I do agree about Peter O'Toole, really. He does Zaltar in Supergirl and the Pope in the 21st century TV series The Tudors.
And older Casanova in Casanova, with David Tennant being the young one.
All exactly the same, and there really should be some differences between those roles. But Helen Slater as Supergirl, she's very good. She does that fish out of water stuff very well. Looks suitably wide-eyed and unsure, and yet sure of the fight for justice that she's having. I think she does a very good job. Lucy Lane, as we were saying, does a very good job interacting with her. And then you've got Faye Dunaway as Selena, and as you were saying as well, a difficult role to play, really, and being a sort of jealous, catty woman as well as a witch. But you certainly couldn't do it any better.
She's got a friend who she talks to. I can't remember her name because she's not very memorable as a character. The role is that Selena bounces off her, but I mean, there's nothing wrong with her performance in that role.
And Peter Kirk as the Warlock, Nigel, I think is quite entertaining. And he's the one who gets to come through for Supergirl in the end and be kind of a goodie. And again, he works at the school, but that's not really linked into the plot. You see him there teaching this class and realising that Kara's some sort of weird genius, but it has really nothing to do with the plot of the movie.
Again, something that they could have expanded on if it were a TV series.
So bags of potential there, and probably a more enjoyable movie than Superman 3 overall in many ways.
I was thinking something along those lines.
Then it was another 3 years before Superman 4, The Quest for Peace was released. They managed to tempt back sulky Christopher Reeve by letting him have a lot of creative input to explore some issues he was interested in, nuclear disarmament being the main one. There's also a section about Clark not wanting the Kent home in Smallville to be sold off for development, but wanting to sell it to a proper farmer, and all the issue of the tabloidization of newspapers, Daily Planet getting bought and corrupted by this mogul, which I think all three of those are very interesting, very important issues, and I do appreciate what the film is saying about them, but I also see why people say Superman 4: The Quest for Peace is a terrible film. As I expect we mentioned on our Masters of the Universe podcast, much of Superman 4's budget was siphoned off by the new production company to make the Masters of the Universe movie, and it really shows in the effects, the flying effects. You'll believe a man can fly, it says famously for the first movie. Richard Pryor in Superman 3 attempts to be funny subverting that line. I just don't believe a man can fly. But if you watch Superman 4, you won't believe a man can fly. You'll believe special effects can look incredibly bad. And that's not the only thing that obviously the budget has suffered from. Christopher Reeve was on record as complaining about some of the locations. There's a bit where we're supposed to be outside the UN building. When it was Richard Donner, we would have been outside the UN building filming that. As it was, we were in a shopping centre in Milton Keynes. That Kansas scene, yeah, it's obviously not the rolling prairies of Kansas like we saw in Superman the movie. It is the fairly flat farmland on the border between Hertfordshire and Cambridgeshire that both of us know quite well. But having said that, films with budgetary constraints can still be very good if they set their minds to it, and I wouldn't say that Superman 4 is very good, although perhaps it's better than Superman 3 in some ways. Something I've often complained about is that it would make more sense if Lana Lang was in it as she comes to Metropolis at the end of Superman 3 to be Perry's PA, and it really struck us this time how Lucy Lane should have been in it as Jimmy's girlfriend. If not Kara, Supergirl, in it. Okay, she retrieved her source of life-giving energy turning round ball thing and took it back to Argo City, so she's no longer in the picture. But yeah, Lucy and Jimmy should be in Superman 4 as a couple. But it seems they kind of want to encourage us not to think too much about Superman 3 and Supergirl. They don't try and retcon them in any way and say, oh, well, these didn't really happen. But they just don't want to talk about them. They want to hark back to the original Superman and Lois, Lex Luthor, and they do hark back to those things. It just all falls rather flat.
Do you know what that reminds me of? Jurassic World. They treat the two sequels to Jurassic Park that make up the original trilogy the same way.
And what they do in Superman 4 to give Superman some actual challenge is a bit like having other Kryptonians there. It's Superman is cloned, and thus he fights his own clone who has his powers or a version of his powers. And that's an idea that's been in the comics and Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, and is a valid idea and a believable sci-fi way to get someone to fight Superman.
Let us just clarify for anyone who might not have seen it. When you first hear that, you imagine a doppelganger, don't you? An identical Superman. But Lex Luthor, in fact, creates a different superhero who's a different actor and has different clothes on, and the addition of nuclear powers to Superman's DNA, called Nuclear Man. And before we talk more about him and whatever else is going on, I'd just like to say I object to every cloning or getting of Superman's DNA that I've ever seen, because it doesn't make sense. Okay, so Superman's divested himself of some hair, but not by the root. In Lois and Clark, he donated a lock of hair for something, but he wouldn't have pulled the lock of hair out by the root. And then when Lex is getting a strand that Superman has donated for this exhibition thing, he cuts it at both ends with bolt cutters, so even if Superman did pull it out by the root, Lex doesn't have it. So that doesn't make enough sense, and it's the sort of thing that some people say, it doesn't matter, it's only a film, but it matters to me because things do make sci-fi sense within their own parameters in Superman, except that.
It's not surprising to find out that quite a lot of footage was removed for the final cut of Superman 4. The runtime is only an hour and 25 minutes. But I certainly always feel at the end of that time, I've had enough Superman 4, and I'm certainly not yearning to see the cut parts. It's obvious that it has got a bit rushed at the end, and the reason that Nuclear Man is coming looking for Lacey, the new Daily Planet publisher, is not made very clear at all. In fact, it's completely brushed over. Lex Luthor says something at the end that pertains to all the bits that were cut and makes no sense. Is the world going to be vaporized? And there was more of Superman being ill and out of commission and getting white hair. I think, well, yeah, it would make more sense for all that stuff in, but by an hour and 20 minutes, I've had enough of Superman 4. I appreciate some of the things it's done and tried to say, but it's not a bad time to stop watching it.
As you say, it doesn't make sense. Nuclear Man being after Lacey. He's seen one picture of her, I think, and he's saying to Superman, where's the woman? And I'm thinking, why do you want to know? And then when he does get hold of her, his idea is to take her into space. And actually, he's very lucky that she doesn't die. As Toad Borg says, without spacesuits, they'll perish in seconds. And I said to you, why does he want her anyway? And you said, because he fancies her, basically, I think. So what's he planning on doing with her in space?
Yes, it really is just forcing this final conclusion fight between Superman and Nuclear Man. And what a fool Superman is, leaving the elevator in direct sunlight so it's going to seep in through the gap in the doors and reawaken Nuclear Man. If he'd stuck that elevator on the dark side of the moon that never gets any sunlight, Superman would already have won.
As we were pointing out, that is quite different from the sun charges Superman. But I think it was definitely inspired by that Nuclear Man is solar powered.
And really it smacks of something quite interesting. Nuclear Man wanting to go off and steal himself a girlfriend. He's kind of rebelling against Lex. Lex wants to use him and control him. I've made you, I'm in charge of you. And the weakness of being completely solar powered does allow Lex to manipulate Nuclear Man. And Nuclear Man wants to go off and discover his own identity and do his own thing. And perhaps in a longer and more interesting movie, he'd have realised he wanted to become good. She's not a bad character, Lacey, because she's one of these people who's introduced as, here's the daughter of the evil media mogul. She's coming in to take over the planet, boo-hiss. But actually, she's a good person and she's interested in the workers at the Daily Planet and their philosophies on journalism and what they have to say. She's interested in people. Oh, Lois, I'm sorry. And she really comes through as a protagonist in the end.
I think she learns from them, doesn't she? She's not like Kovu in The Lion King 2, Simba's Pride, and that kind of character actively going in as a saboteur and then finding out that she's not evil after all. But I think having grown up with her father and had his influence and not really known anything else, she's learned from the Daily Planet people that this is not the right way and she wants to model herself on their ethos rather than her father's.
Yes, it's good to follow a character on a personal journey, and that is a positive aspect of the movie. They want to really big up the Superman and Lois relationship again, and it's a shame that they do kind of make it very abusive. Superman uses Lois as his support network and then makes her forget about it, and she's seemingly okay with that.
He throws her off the roof terrace. And 2 seconds later going, hello, look, I'm Superman, I've caught you. Doesn't make that okay.
But again, Margot Kidder, with her warmth and her honesty, really brings Lois to life very well. Very much caring about Superman as a person. Interesting, when she has the letter for Superman, she takes it straight to Clark. Perhaps she doesn't quite realise why at the time, but she knows in there somewhere. When Superman's disappeared, he's sick, she goes to Clark and takes him Superman's cape. If you see Superman, you might need this. And she does the very heartfelt bit about, I would like to tell Superman these things about how wonderful he is and how he's made me feel. Clark's like, well, gosh, Lois, if you could hear that, I know you'd be grateful. Those kind of scenes between those two, I do like. It's a shame they're lost in rather a bad movie. So unsurprisingly, that brought an end to the Donnerverse, rather an inglorious end. Overall, while watching it, as I was saying, we've had more to complain about than to say, oh, that was good. But it really does contain the bits of Superman that I really like and engage with. But Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, is a kind of successor to the Christopher Reeve movies. It's the next thing in the franchise. It builds on their popularity. New Adventures, as in here's the next thing after the Christopher Reeve movies. And it premiered in the new season of 1993. There are 4 seasons, so it ended up finishing in the middle of 1997. It's a funny old animal for me because it has, in my opinion, a very good cast doing a very good job all the way through. The setup of the Daily Planet and Jonathan and Martha Kent in Smallville, the city of Metropolis are all very well realised. It's a tangible world. And yet, with the way it's pulled off, I think the series as a whole is very bad. And it so easily could have been very good.
I was disappointed with the DVDs when I got them. It turns out it's the sort of show where you would like to have a best of selection, like Buffy. When it was on when I was in my late teens, I was doing sort of GCSEs, A-levels, I think. I was very interested in it. It was a repeat.
Yeah, when it was first on, it it was kind of on in our house in the evenings at kind of supper time, and our parents sort of watched it and liked it, and I remember watching it, the early ones with Lex Luthor. And then we didn't really watch the later seasons. We caught the end of some of them before Live and Kicking later in the 90s. They put them on early in the morning, and we sort of kept track. And that's what's going on in the New Adventures of Superman. But then we engaged with a repeat run in the early noughties. They started having it on Thursday supper times, and we found the pilot and said, "Oh, shall we have this for our supper?" "Oh, yes." And we kept following it and kept watching it all the way through over several months. And really, yes, did engage with it. In some ways enjoyed it. In some ways started to spot its problems.
And this is where you need to remember what I had retained and the misconceptions I had got from watching the films when I was little. I couldn't really remember what any of the film actors looked like. So these were my Superman and Clark and Lois and Perry and Jimmy and Martha and Jonathan. Most people's Jonathan is dead, I think, isn't he? And I really didn't know very much about what was going on. As I said, I thought it was like Super Ted and Banana Man turned into Superman. And it's a lot to do with the premise, isn't it? This is the real one, Clark, which means that Clark will use his powers as Clark as long as he thinks no one's looking. So that really helped me to understand he just had superpowers all the time, and he put the costume on because he didn't want people to realise. And I found out about Krypton, and I found out who everybody was besides Lois and Superman, because I hadn't really remembered anyone else from the films. And I found out how he had grown up in Smallville and moved to Metropolis. And there was one thing that it didn't explain very well if you don't know, which is Kryptonians wouldn't have powers on Krypton if it was there. That's the one thing that I missed. There are other Kryptonians in it, and they're like, oh, she's a Kryptonian and he's a Kryptonian, so they've got the same powers as Superman, but it really doesn't explain why that happens. It kind of makes it sound like it's an alien race with superpowers. So that was the one thing that became clear when I rewatched the films, having seen Lois and Clark. But apart from that, it really taught me everything about Superman. And I found it rather weird to see other people playing the characters when first we did revisit the films. And that was really what got me into Superman. So that's why it's sort of quite special to me. But I wish it was more special. I wish the DVDs hadn't come with so many problems in the plots, in the characterization, in the struggling for ideas to keep it going, hedging their bets about when and how and whether at all Lois and Clark were going to get together, and all these things we mentioned, like magic powers, red kryptonite, other Kryptonians in ways that don't really make a lot of sense, putting him down a dark hole so he's not exposed to the sunlight. All these things appear as a symptom of, well, how are we going to challenge Superman now? We've done 2 seasons, we've done everything. What else is there?
One way they challenge the fact that Superman is very overpowered is that he's incredibly slow and indecisive. There are so many times where Superman could come in, take the thing off the baddie, and that's the end of the episode. But he doesn't. He comes in and folds his arms around. The baddie says, "Ha-ha, Superman, here I have something to defeat you." And Superman doesn't then grab the thing. He goes, "That thing can't defeat me." The baddie goes, "Ah, but now it can. So Superman should then grab it anyway." But he doesn't. He said, "Oh, can it really?" And the baddie goes, "Yes, here I show you." And then Superman is in trouble. And they have to have that sort of level of inaction from Superman for many of the episodes to actually have a denouement, which I thought was rather lazy and disappointing, but I suppose an easy trap to fall into, because if Superman does what he's clearly capable of, and sometimes does decide to do when we get to the end of the episode, come in and just use his superpowers to leave everyone else thinking, "Oh, what happened? Oh, I've been defeated," then it wouldn't really work as a show with a denouement.
A variant of that is I've got this thing that's going to blow up Lois or electrocute her or something if you move at all. I'm going to activate it now. Here I go. Press the button. Oh, look, now if you move, you're going to make Lois get blown up. He should have got it before the guy pressed the button.
There's an episode late in Series 4 about the weird, mad, evil toy maker who kidnaps children, where that sort of thing's going on, and Lois is behind these bars, and Superman suddenly rushes and in the blink of an eye has bent the bars and rescued Lois and released all the children. And the weird evil toy maker's like, whoa, I didn't even have time to press my button. Superman should do that sort of thing all the time, but he just doesn't.
You can, as we were just saying, see how that happens with the TV series. It would probably have happened with this Supergirl TV series that we would like to see.
They're all very good, the cast, but they have to work with some absolute crap, and they certainly do their best. Dean Cain as Superman, he does instill the kind of convincing but at times funny and surreal heroicism like Christopher Reeve, but he also makes Clark and Superman very real characters, perhaps less of a kind of construct than in the movies, because that's the level you need for a TV series, and I think Dean Cain does that very well.
I think so too. I think he's not one of these actors who can take something that is a bit crap and elevate it and make it funny. If he's got some bad material, it falls flat on his face. But then there are bits that he really makes work very well. I don't know if I'd even like to say those bits are well written, but there's this one episode, I think it's a season 4 episode, and he and Lois are married, so it must be, where someone else is in his body. Other guy's body, and Dean Cain is acting this man who's sort of bodies with Clark and found out that he's Superman and that he's married to Lois, and they've decided, Lois and Clark, but not Clark, that they'd like to go to bed, and then there's this emergency on the radio and Lois is trying to persuade him to go and sort it out, and he thinks she's talking about going to bed with him, and he makes that work very well. Shouldn't you, whoosh, and he's like, oh yeah, we can whoosh all night. And I don't think I can really pull that off, but I think he pulled it off very well. And that kind of thing, which really brings us to the chemistry, doesn't it, between the two leads, Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher as Lois. She's excellent too, and I think she's a very good comedy actress, and I think she might have that skill that Dean Cain is somewhat lacking in. She can elevate material that's perhaps not quite so good.
They do have a lot of chemistry, and they certainly do work as a two leads, and it's a shame they have to wade through so much crap before they get to develop their chemistry and resolve their ship and get on with their real wedding. Not that they really end up having a real wedding. One's a clone and one's on an ethereal magical island in heaven. And their marriage certificate says they've got married at Metropolis City Hall. I mean, that's a lie, isn't it? No matter how you look at it. But I realised watching the whole series through recently, I would nominate Terry Hatcher as my favourite cast member. I think she does handle all the various different aspects of the show the best, wading through the crap the best, doing the comedy the best, bringing the character to life the best. She has the challenging task of playing a woman written by mostly men and not making her too bitchy and overly confrontational. And she does a very good job when necessary of mitigating that sort of thing. And she also very convincingly brings to life the deeper, more emotional aspects of Lois as a character. It's partly the fault of the status quo of the series not wanting Clark to reveal his secret, but I was really struck by Lois as we got towards the end of series 2. How open and honest and full disclosure she was being about her feelings to Clark and to Superman, not having quite realised they're the same person yet. I thought Terry Hatcher was doing those things really well, and I believed her feelings about herself and their relationship, and all that made Clark, the character, come across, I thought, as terrible. It's one of these times when the character is hiding a secret to maintain the status quo, and it's actually become emotionally abusive to his significant other not to have let her in on it, to still be deceiving her in these ways. Particularly when she's pouring out her heart to both parts of him. And I think Terry Hatcher was bringing her to life brilliantly. And perhaps Dean Cain was a bit less able to mitigate Clark being an absolute bastard with the material he was given.
Yes, I agree with all of that. And it reminds me of an episode that was very striking, where Clark's parents get kidnapped so that some baddie can manipulate Superman. I can't remember which baddie. Was it a one-off baddie? There are so many of them. But what is memorable about that is the interaction between Lois and Clark. And Lois is saying, come on, Clark, what's going on? What's the big secret? Why can't you turn up for dates and not run off and all this kind of thing? And he turns around and says, my parents have been kidnapped. And my initial reaction to that is, oh, good, that's a convenient truth you can tell her to avoid the one that you want to keep to yourself. And then the way that Lois reacts is very heartfelt and honest, and she even comes up with a plan to endanger her life in order to save Martha and Jonathan, which involves getting Superman to cryogenically freeze her. I don't think it makes a lot of sense, but she performs the whole thing so well, and she's done everything that she can to help Clark, and she's put herself at risk, and she's been so honest, and he's continued to dance around the subject of I'm Superman whilst accepting her help. As you say, it makes him seem like a right dick.
Lois really was putting everyone else in the series, particularly Clark, to shame at that point, late season 2. And the kind of excuse they're coming up with in season 3, you were reminding me, Clark, saying, ooh, I had to propose to you before telling you I was Superman, even though she worked it out by then. Ooh, I had to be sure you loved me and not Superman. Ooh, I couldn't be sure. As if he has the emotional right to kind of test her in that way. It's not a good excuse at all. It just makes him seem even worse.
Again, it's trying to write their way around problems, and it's just never going to work.
You talked about hedging their bets, didn't you? I couldn't believe how they cut off at the end of season 2 for a cliffhanger Lois's reply to Clark's proposal that I remembered all too well. Who's asking? Clark, take off the glasses, or Superman? They cut it short. It just ended at Clark, and that was the end of the season. And thank God they realised, yes, we have to put in that who's asking, Clark or Superman, and go from there for season 3. You've got to move the show on at that point. It was already ridiculous.
They must have asked their focus groups. We can't air this without testing it on some focus groups, and I think the focus group probably said, for God's sake, why did you even cut it in the first place? We're so sick of this. Of course we want Lois to be in on it. There's a very telling bit of a review on the back of my season 3 DVD where someone has said this is the best Lois and Clark since ages and ages and ages ago. And perhaps it isn't really, except that when you watch it you feel like you're enjoying it more because you were so sick of her not knowing.
Early season 3 was the bit I enjoyed most because they were in it together and they were working together to sort out whatever was going on, and Clark wasn't being emotionally manipulative anymore. Season 3 then took a massive dive with all this Lois is a clone and Lois loses her memory and we have to delay the wedding, which took it down to the doldrums of being worse than it ever was.
I think shortly we'll just go through some of those problems of each season. Before we do that, we've better mention Perry, who's the other cast member who never changed actor and was in all 4 seasons. Besides the Kents, who we've mentioned briefly, Martha and Jonathan played by Kay Callan and Eddie Jones. And you said how they have their place in the series. It's very good. We did agree that Eddie Jones's acting wasn't quite up to the standard of everyone else. And it works well not having him die of a heart attack.
That was something that struck me when we watched it in the early noughties. Oh yes, I really think having Martha and Jonathan there as regular characters is a good idea for a TV series. And of course in the first 2 seasons Clark needs them to talk to them about being Superman, and when he can talk to Lois about that in the other 2 seasons, unsurprisingly, Martha and Jonathan start to lose their role in the show a bit and they struggle to use them, rather like Holly in Red Dwarf after Crichton turned up.
And then back to Perry, played by Lane Smith, who is very striking in the role.
He's really very good, very entertaining, very memorable. I always had him as something I really remembered about having watched the show, even way back in the mid-90s, before really engaging with it properly. I always remembered that his Perry is absolutely obsessed with Elvis Presley. Sometimes the writers make too much of that, but Lane Smith does an absolutely wonderful job bringing him to life. Sometimes quite funny, sometimes very fatherly, as the patriarch of the Daily Planet, and it's good when writers remember that he has faith in and can be trusted by Lois and Clark. They have a very good working relationship, and he's quite happy to let them go off and follow their instincts. And if they need to do something a bit dodgy, then they can let him in on it. Ones where they're saying, oh, Perry can't find out about this, that, and the other, will be in trouble. I don't believe so much. But Lane Smith always does a great job, and as you say, very striking, and a very important part of the show.
It can be used very badly, doing some sort of subplot that they think is funny and actually is really cringy, particularly ones which involve Jimmy, who we haven't talked about yet, and Jimmy really links to what happens after season 1, because one of the things that happens is that they recast him. And in season 1 he's played by Michael Landes, and he's played very well by Michael Landes, and in seasons 2, 3 and 4 he's played by Justin Whalen, and he's played very well by Justin Whalen too, I think. I can see why they thought it was a good idea to recast Jimmy, and actually if I had to pick one, I would pick Justin Whalen.
I've always thought, and I still do, it's rather unnecessary and cruel to Michael Landes to kick him out after season 1 and recast him. They went back to the pool of fresh-faced young actors who played Jimmy. I think the one difference really with Justin Whalen is that he's very baby-faced. But apparently the excuse was given that Michael Landes looked too much like Dean Cain. They experimented with a couple of looks for Michael Landes through the first series.
I think that that's the polite version of why they decided to get rid of him, because watching the pilot, I thought, oh, they look a bit similar, don't they? Dean and Michael Landes as Jimmy. And I did think Jimmy was quite cute, which was what they wanted. He's not baby-faced, but he makes up for it, or he did in those days, by having a very high voice. And I really did notice that, because sometimes I found it a bit distracting, especially when they changed his hair, which I thought maybe was an attempt to make him look less like Dean Cain, and then it didn't go with his voice. And he still did look quite like Dean Cain, so I can see why they thought it wasn't working. Having said that, I don't think it was necessary to recast.
There are 2 other actors who appear in the opening credits main stars of season 1 who aren't in the other 3 seasons. One of those is Tracy Scoggins as Cat Grant, a character from the comics who is horribly misused in the first season of Lois and Clark and then unceremoniously dumped. As you were saying, they would have done better to have her as Lois's friend and confidant. Lois really needed one of those in the series, but instead, being 2 women, they're written as sniping at each other for absolutely no reason, and Cat has no real contribution to make to any episode she's in.
It's dreadful. I've seen comic book pages with Cat going out to have a relaxing after-work drink with Lois and chatting as friends do. I think it's a real shame that the writers thought that the best use of an attractive, confident woman journalist was to make her bicker with Lois and have no contribution to make to the valuable output of the Daily Planet. I think it's an absolute disgrace, and I think it's terrible that their solution to this was to get rid of the character. They could have kept her and told the new writing crew, because they scrapped the whole writing crew as well, you got to make better use of Cat. She's got to be Lois's friend. She's got to help her. She's got to do some actual journalism sometimes. That kind of thing. I don't see why that would work. And I don't see anything wrong with Tracy Scoggins that would mean that she couldn't do that kind of performance. I think she does everything she can with what she's given, which unfortunately isn't nearly enough.
Then we also get and John Shea as Lex Luthor in season 1, and apparently he had trouble with his commute and was hastily written out at the end of the season, and it was obviously a decision that was regretted to kill him off, because he's brought back to life and appears in 2 episodes of season 2 and 1 of season 3, and then he dies again. He provides a voice on a tape for an episode of season before. They could have cut back his involvement in the show without getting rid of him, which I think would have been the better idea in order to combat his problems with the commute. But I do think he's one of the more positive aspects of season 1. John Shea as Lex Luthor, I think he's very good, particularly in his double act with Tony J as Lex's butler, Nigel. One of the problems I had with season 1, whatever was happening, most of the time, there are some episodes without Lex Luthor being the main driving force behind the evil, but most of the time, whatever was happening, we'd cut to Lex in his limo or whatever saying, "Ha-ha, I'm the one causing all this evil." And I think they did overdo that rather. But on the other hand, it's important to have him there as the main villain, who's got his fingers in a lot of pies with LexCorp and is responsible for a lot of the evil, because without that, as you were saying, you get a lot of goofy villains.
I was just thinking, I prefer John Shea's Lex Luthor to Gene Hackman's, and basically that's the reason they don't play him for laughs. Perhaps making the films, they thought this is a fun and a colourful film and the villain needs to be comedic, and they thought this wouldn't be appropriate for Lois and Clark. And then I guess the new writing staff disagreed with that and brought in a bunch of Gene Hackman imitators. It does have, doesn't it, a sort of slightly more serious tone, not like super ethereal. You were talking earlier about how Christopher Reeve is dressed in very, very bright primary colours. Dean Cain, they dress in more muted primary colours, but still the Superman costume. It's when you get up to Henry Cavill time that they start taking away the pants and messing about with colours, isn't it? And Lex Luthor fits in well with that kind of tone that they're going for. And you do get the odd bit of comedy with Nigel in particular and with other people that he might be dealing with. But it's not forced and it's not too much, and he performs the part very, very well indeed. And I think he also has chemistry with all the rest of the cast when he gets to interact with them, and particularly he gets to interact with Lois because they do this whole thing where she nearly marries him, which I thought was a bit annoying actually. I could see why they thought it would be good dramatically, but it's not really in character for her to marry the first man who'll have her after Superman says, "No, I don't think we can be a couple actually, Lois, sorry."
I was struck by how badly written the first season was in some of the dialogue and plots, and I think it's probably not a bad idea to cull the whole writing team. I don't think the new writers particularly did better than the first, although I suppose perhaps they were a little better.
Much we were saying they hadn't fixed the problem of Clark being such a dick. One thing they perhaps got told not to do was have too little of Superman. Season 1 had Clark sneakily using his powers and not wearing the costume until like the last 10 minutes. It did that way too much, but you can easily sort that out if you kept the original writing crew. Say, look, have more of Superman be Superman. Bring him in about 20 minutes in and then again at the end. And the other things, the characterization of Clark being kind of a dick and emotionally abusive, I don't think that they fixed those things, and I think that some season 1 episodes are as good as some of the later episodes, and I think that many of the later episodes are as bad as many of the season 1 episodes.
One thing that I thought was a huge problem in Series 1 was that Lois and Superman did not interact nearly enough. In fact, they hardly interacted at all. And then to have Lois feel like, "Oh, I can't say yes to Lex Luthor until I've checked if Superman loves me," it made absolutely no sense at all. Obviously, for the setup of the show, yeah, that's what's going to happen, but they haven't backed it up in the character interaction.
So then along comes season 2, and they've got a bunch of new writers who are making Superman be in it more often as Superman and have some more chats with Lois, and those are good things. But then there are still problems like in that episode we talked about with the kidnapped Kents, where Clark's holding on to his secret much too jealously, emotionally abusing Lois, not combating the bad guys properly, standing around posing and posturing too much. Also, he will waste up to a minute trying to sort out his excuse why he needs to leave the room when there's airplanes exploding, and he's like, oh, I've got to go and get some shirts. Oh, but you can get some shirts after work. Oh no, they're closing early today. I don't know, I'm making this up, but it's the sort of thing he might have said.
I'm remembering how in season 1 now it was striking me how Superman wasn't being proactive enough. That's one way he was holding back, not doing what the superhero should be doing. there was this whole thing about Lois was in some trouble and there was some crime family after her. I thought, well, why isn't Superman out sorting these guys out? Then we saw, oh, he's at home making a stew.
And of course, there being no Lex, except for when he's resurrected by a woman who loves him, because that's what women do, they love the men, you get all these silly villains which keep coming up, and there are so many of them, and it's just excruciating trying to watch them. I suppose some of them are more successful than others. In the meantime, everybody's getting so bored of Lois not knowing that Clark is Superman. Perhaps it's an early season 2 one then, because I don't think we are feeling very annoyed about that, which is my favourite episode and one that I would most definitely put on the best of DVD, which is the one where Lucy Lane's boyfriend gets in like a car crash or something and some bad guys turn him into a cyborg with a kryptonite battery. And I think that is a good way to challenge Superman. Fighting a robot with a kryptonite battery is going to be very challenging for him. And also, they make, I think, the best use of Perry and Jimmy. And it's to do with their professional relationship and their work at the Daily Planet. Lois stops Jimmy from taking a photograph of Superman for the paper, being vulnerable and down in this fight against the cyborg. Perry says, Jimmy, you've got to take all the pictures. And I like the way Jimmy didn't say, Lois told me not to. Then Lois volunteered, it's my fault, Chief, I told him not to take the picture. And Perry didn't go off on one at either of them. He said, look, you're both professionals. You've got to do what's best for the newspaper. And that interaction with the three of them I thought was very well done and very appropriate. And it tied in well with this plot that I liked with the Kryptonite cyborg.
It succeeds in doing those things that most episodes can only dream of doing in terms of plot, characterization, believable villain for Superman to fight. Season 2 kicks off a couple of things that I remembered as being very annoying negative aspects of the show after watching that repeat run, namely H.G. Wells keeps turning up in his time machine and messing about with Lois and Clark's destiny and stuff, and it really doesn't make that kind of sci-fi sense. And the antagonist in that whole thing is this character called Tempest, who's supposed to be funny but isn't. And Superman's powers keep getting transferred to other people.
Another thing about Season 2 is it introduces a name that we are going to now blacklist. He's getting on the list along with Richard Lester, and that name is Chris Rupenthal. And as far as I recall, Chris Rupenthal doesn't actually write any Season 2 episodes, which is a mercy. But it's around that time when we were talking about the annoying finale and hedging their bets and getting towards the end of the season, when it kept saying creative consultant Chris Rupenthal. And one day, it popped up at the end and Jake went, "Stop consulting Chris Rupenthal. Wiser words have never been spoken." Then he does start actually writing episodes in Season 3, and they're the really bad ones. And I've got quite clever at recognising a Chris Rupenthal opening. They're doing the most pathetic joke and or saying these lines to each other which are meant to be very clever and just are not. And I go, oh, this is Chris Rupenthal, this is a Chris Rupenthal joke. And it was as soon as Chris Rupenthal started writing episodes that one of the two original creators died, wasn't it? Written by Chris Rupenthal, later in memory of Jerry Siegel.
So really, for the reasons we've already mentioned, I was finding it very hard to watch at the end of Season 2. And then, as I say, it did pick up at the start of Season 3, when they were working together to do stuff together. And then it took this massive dive when the wedding kept being delayed for those reasons like I was saying. I think it was a shame that Perry didn't end up officiating at their proper wedding. It had to be David Doyle, the angel, instead. I really liked Perry's wedding ceremony. It was heartfelt, but short. Superman's powers getting transferred to other people the whole time. I don't like that. The episode where Lois had them instead of Clark and she's Ultra Woman, Dean, Kane and Terry had to really make that episode work, and I think it would have to go on the best of because it's quite good. But the idea I don't like, and that helped to drag season 3 down into the doldrums, where it really was with them splitting up and we can't possibly be together and we can and we can't get married, I don't want to get married, I do.
The Ultra Woman episode comes just before all that, where they can't decide whether to be together or not. As you say, they are working together, and I too would put it on the best of DVD. What's good about it is that interaction between them, that teamwork, and also their villain comedy double act is one of the more successful ones because it is Shelley Long and Mary Gross from Sabrina, so as I call them, Shelley Long and Mrs. Quick. And of course, in that episode, they subvert the whole Superman rescues Lois out of trouble thing by having them get Clark without his powers and tie him up. That episode comes immediately before, or is it immediately after, another very memorable one where somebody else has his powers. They've got transferred to this child via an electrical storm when he was landing an aeroplane. So perhaps if you counted up the episodes where it happened, you could count them on the fingers of one hand, but that's still too many because it is kind of stupid and they do it twice in a row. And then, as you say, after that, that's where it really takes a dive. Clark doesn't want to be together with Lois, and then he does, and Lois is like, well, I might have changed my mind, actually. And then they go and pose as this couple who need couple counselling in this place where they're actually evil, and they put the couples in glass tubes for some reason to do something with them. And then Chris Rupenthal is responsible for all that. Oh, yes, they got married now. Oh, no, hang on a minute, Lois is a clone. And the real Lois has lost her memory, and Lex tries to manipulate her into thinking that she's in love with him. She loses her memory again straight away. She gets another blow to the head and gets a second bout of amnesia. So then you get this evil doctor who clearly needs to be struck off, making his amnesia patient think that she's in love with him.
I really was feeling indignant about them having made that show and me sitting there watching it at that point. And I'd always remembered the culmination of that awful section being where the other Kryptonians from the colony turn up and Clark has to go off and marry one of them, and we've already talked about the problem with that, blindly following the wishes of your dead ancestors.
You were saying, I think not completely seriously, tell them to get stuffed. You don't owe them anything. They've got no rights over you. And I said, and I think actually you agreed with me on this, so I will help you sort out your political issues, but I won't marry you, and when it's sorted out, I'm going to come back to Earth.
And then when he eventually does start doing that in season 4, we think, now it's back on track. And then he says, well, I'd better get in this molecule chamber and let them execute me, actually. And I utterly deflate once again.
That leads into the Zod equivalent, who's called Nor. Like I sort of wish Lenny Luthor was Charlie Sheen, I really wish Nor was played by Alan Rickman. He's that kind of villain, and he's meant to be funny as well as threatening, and it falls absolutely flat. He's holding Smallville hostage, and Superman has to come and try to deal with him, and they end up doing a fight where they poke each other with these big plastic sticks instead of proper hand-to-hand combat, and Nor's all like, aha, this will be our final battle, Kal-El. He can't even say Kal-El. It annoys the bejesus out of me.
Superman is always refusing to, or not realizing he can, play to his strengths. He's always letting villains drag him into playing their game, their way, as Seamus the Fly might put it. But he really doesn't need to do that. He can just come in and sort it out in his own way with his own powers, being more experienced on Earth than other Kryptonians, instead of poking them with sticks that they provide.
And I do think after the Kryptonians go away, even if it's only for a brief period, season 4 does pick up, and we notice that Chris Rupenthal is gone. Lois and Clark are married, and they're working together, and they're trying to sort out various things, which are probably a bit stupid. Like that body swap episode I was mentioning, where the actors managed to make quite a success of it.
I like Dr. Klein as a character and his role in doing the science with Superman and seeing if his sperm is compatible with his eggs and things like that. I don't think they should try and make comedy out of Dr. Klein. That doesn't work. But I like his role in the show.
I kept expecting him because I'd seen him such a lot watching the DVDs first off, and then we were watching them together. I was like, where's Dr. Klein? And in season 2, they had this doctor doing the same thing that Dr. Klein would end up doing, saying, well, this is what's wrong with Superman. And then I said, I expect this gives them the idea, and Dr. Klein comes along in season 3, and then suddenly there he was, and they spoke to him as though we were supposed to know who he is, and they've been working with him all along. And I agree with you, I think he's a very valuable addition to the show.
I don't think anyone should be surprised or not surprised on finding out that Lois and Clark, or Superman and Lois, aren't genetically compatible. They are really, after all, a different species, even though they could easily have made some sort of baby hybrid that was very much a viable offspring, because they're very similar organisms. Then they wanted to continue Lois and Clark into season 5 with this adopted baby, which we reckon must be from New Krypton.
I read that the plan was that they would be raising this Kryptonian baby, and I think it said that they planned to say that it was from Zara, who's one of his allies from Krypton from that segment, and I can't remember if she gave birth to the baby herself or what it said they were planning. And I remember thinking, I don't know why they don't keep their own baby. I don't know why they need to send it to her. Perhaps they do explain that, but the whole thing sounded very stupid. And more stupid than anything was that this baby was going to have accelerated growth and be teenaged by season 5, which isn't very satisfying. If you ship Lois and Clark and you're happy to see them get a baby, you want them to experience raising the baby over a number of years.
I always thought they should use Jimmy, or ask Jimmy if he would like to be a sperm donor. I think he'd have been really touched. So there we are. They wanted to continue Lois and Clark, and they didn't get to, and it sounds like we'd missed out on stuff that perhaps was going to be even more stupid than what we'd seen already. So there's something to be thankful for.
I was a bit annoyed to read that this baby, who was going to be another Superman, was a boy as well. And I don't have anything against boys. I said on our Flintstones podcast, all the children in these things are boys. They should only be boys sometimes, and they should sometimes be girls. And I do think this is one of the times it would have been appropriate for the child to be a girl, because she could have been like their interpretation of Supergirl. We already got Superman. So a regular Kryptonian female, I would have actually been quite interested to see, and that might have made me think, oh yeah, I kind of wouldn't have minded if that had gone ahead.
Smallville ran from 2001 to 2010 and was billed as a Superman prequel, but doesn't really fit in with the continuity, like Bates Motel being a Psycho prequel, and ends up as Clark in Metropolis being Superman but not Superman, which sounds very annoying. We haven't seen any of that. I think it's interesting and fitting that Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder had guest spots, and indeed Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher in Smallville, and Annette O'Toole, who played Lana Lang in Superman 3, was Martha, Superman's mum, in Smallville, so it's certainly an interesting Superman melting pot, if nothing else. A lot of people like it very much.
I saw one clip of it once where Clark and his contemporaries were trying to find out something by listening to a soundbite on a computer, and Clark used his super hearing to hear something in the recording that no one else could, as you can imagine. And they're like, how did you hear that? And he said something like, I guess I missed one too many Linkin Park concerts. And I thought, I bet that this exact scene happens all the time, just staged a bit differently. I don't think I need to watch any more now.
It probably should be like 2 seasons of actual Superman midquel than really trying to expand it into a huge new universe of its own. That's my suspicion, based on not that much information. It's no coincidence that Marlon Brando died in 2005. and Superman Returns with Brandon Routh was released in 2006 using some of the Marlon Brando footage of the Fortress of Solitude and being a kind of alternative Superman 3 but set in the early 21st century, and that was awful in many ways. Lex Luthor is growing new land out of bits of the Fortress of Solitude. That doesn't work. It was just this one green crystal that grew the Fortress of Solitude. You can't pick bits off the Fortress of Solitude and grow Atlantis out of it.
Lois had Superman's love child, and as you pointed out when we first watched Superman 2, after seeing that, they go to bed together after he's got rid of his superpowers. You say apparently his sperm is still super at this point.
And they were still maintaining the Clark double identity. Oh, Superman's been away for 5 years or something, and Superman returned. And so does Clark. Oh, hey Clark, you're back from your 5-year retreat or whatever. It made absolutely no sense.
And it was out of character for Superman to go off on some wild goose chase. He wasn't even sure of what he was doing. I think the cast were all really unappealing too, weren't they?
So we hate that movie, and so does everybody else, and that's why a new franchise didn't really spin off it. And then when Henry Cavill was brought in,
also a Tudors actor like Peter O'Toole, a better Tudors actor,
to relaunch the character Superman in 2013 and Man of Steel, we went to see that in the cinema. We absolutely hated it. It's not Henry Cavill's fault. I think he's brilliant, very entertaining, particularly in the Tudors. We did think the casting of Man of Steel on IMDb sounded rather suspicious, like someone had deliberately cast all the wrong people to play these characters. Kevin Costner as Jonathan Kent, is that going to work? No. Russell Crowe as Jor-El, is that going to be good? No. Lawrence Fishburne as Perry? No, I don't think so.
Amy Adams as Lois wasn't really quite right either. And Henry Cavill as Superman was very surprising because we knew him as Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk from the Tudors. Didn't seem like a Superman, but I guess he was okay.
And it has launched this new Justice League franchise, which during the previous decade was very successful. Henry Cavill has played Superman 3 or 4 times now. He's going to catch up with Marc McClure soon, I'm sure. It's one of those things, Man of Steel, where they've taken an idea and rejiggled it and haven't realised that it then doesn't make sense. I think particularly of the part on Krypton, where they are banishing General Zod and his followers while the planet is exploding, and they all know the planet is exploding and they're all about to die. If you're going to banish General Zod and his followers and give them, as Marlon Brando puts it, a chance for life, nonetheless, you can't be thinking at the same time, oh, well, we're all about to die, let's send off these 3 criminals. You've got to be thinking, we're banishing them from our planet, our society, which is still active, is still viable. In a sense, you're punishing these 3 criminals by saving them from the destruction of the planet. If you know it's exploding all around you while you're doing it, it made absolutely no sense. I didn't like the aspect of it as a first contact movie, really. It's a different way to do Superman. It's not an invalid way to do Superman. I just didn't like it. And all those bits with bloody Kevin Costner going, oh, don't use your superpowers, don't use your superpowers. And then Henry Cavill's like, well, shall I save you from the tornado? And he's like, no, not if it means using your superpowers. So he's dead in the tornado.
That's very annoying. Blindly doing what your parent tells you. You've got to make your own decisions about your superpowers. I think it's fine to ask for advice and take people as your confidant and discuss it with them, but really, I don't think you want to be saying, yes, boss, to their ideas about your superpowers. But you know what I hate? The way they use the Kryptonian names. Oh, this is my husband, Jaw, and this is my son, Cal. They don't do that. It's doing what conquerors have been doing to other cultures over the centuries. Seeing something that isn't like their culture and their way of doing and understanding things and changing it so it's more like what they know and believe to be superior. Okay, Cal is the first name and L is the family name, but the way they use names on Krypton is just use it all together. Kal-El. And to say his name is Kal, it's forcing Earth culture onto these Kryptonian characters, and I thoroughly disapprove, and I think it suggests a lack of intelligence and understanding in whoever decided to do that.
So there we are. Despite the fact that Superman isn't a favourite franchise in our household, we've recorded what is undoubtedly our longest podcast yet about it, because we had quite a lot of thoughts and issues evoked from watching the Christopher Reeve films and the New Adventures of Superman series, and certainly I think it was all worth saying. Hopefully you thought so too, and you'll join us again next time, which will be the final Sunday in October, for a podcast on
the Bill and Ted movies.
Until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.